Hello, we are here today at the University of Central Florida with Dr. Peter Jacques and myself, Irene Artigas, on behalf of the Prince Mohammad bin Fahd program at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Peter Jacques is a political science professor here at UCF and an expert in global environmental politics and sustainability. How are you today, Mr. Jacques?
Well, you?
Well, it is no secret that the Middle East and North Africa is facing some environmental issues, more specifically food security. And what previous environmental policies, inspired from anywhere around the world, could be implemented to alleviate this situation, this crisis that's currently going on?
Well, so you have there's a lot of differences in the region, and there's a lot of different kind of histories. So you couldn't really just do kind of a single type policy. And then food security itself is a very complex kind of place where a lot of things cross over. However, there are kind of some consistent themes that would typically make sense. So, for example, there are kind of general rules for sustainability, and that and when it comes to, for example, groundwater, you don't have to be a genius to know that if you take more out than is refreshed, you're gonna face water scarcity. That's going to make it tough for irrigating or other important uses for the water that are required for food. And that hasn't happened. Actually, as much as simple as that is, there are many places. So, for example, in Iran, where they're facing a very kind of deep water crisis. There have been kind of whole lakes that have dried out, and when a place like Iran is facing that kind of crisis, then things don't get better usually. So it could, it is not the case that as soon as there's a problem, an environmental problem that kind of touches on our subsistence, that things get violent. Cooperation can come out of those kinds of problems, but the irony of that is that Iran has a tremendous ancient history for managing groundwater, specifically in a really sustainable way. There was a tradition of digging what are called qanats, and these are 100% sustainable. And the way they work is that you dig parallel trenches and tunnels into a hill, and then you put holes sporadically across those trenches. Otherwise, they're covered, and it simply collects the rainwater that's coming to the mountain. And so you're essentially collecting rainwater, and you're not touching the groundwater. Well, they abandoned those as soon as you started kind of changing the economy more towards an oil-based economy, and so they've put themselves in a really, really desperate spot. There are kind of simple measures. There's definitely conservation measures that are very important. So, for example, when it comes to growing food, and we're not just talking about growing food when it comes to food security, of course, because trade is very, very important. Preceding some of the complex kind of cascading problems that we saw kind of led up to the Syrian issue, there was a tremendous drought, and there's kind of debate, although I think the evidence is stronger on the side of those who think that drought, which wouldn't really have happened the same way without human-caused climate change, caused an enormous amount of people who left their farms because the farms didn't grow anything because the water was scarce. Those people then went to the cities. Urban crises devolved into revolution, and then the revolution was suppressed by the leader, and then you have it gets worse and worse, right? So you have a window of opportunity for ISIS. You have then the unspeakable refugee crisis that's really it's almost like beyond regional at this point, right? It certainly spans many of the countries in the region. For example, Somalia has a lot of refugees leaving. In addition to that, you had that drought that precipitated a loss of crops in China. And there was a lot of people, and in Russia too, but that was a source for a lot of people's food in the region. They were importing the food from other countries that then themselves just didn't have it. So conservation measures around, kind of a global perspective, because everything's so interconnected. Conservation of soil, for example, pretty much makes sense everywhere. And that gives you more ability to kind of deal with stresses that may surprise you, like the onset of a drought. And we probably should be thinking that those kinds of what we call extreme events just shouldn't be surprises anymore. We should be ready for them and kind of prepare different kinds of tools for populations to handle those. The heat extremes of the 20th century are going to be the norms of the 21st century. So we already know that that's on hand, and we know that you can't control it. So apart from helping, kind of decrease greenhouse gases, so that you don't just keep building and building the heat trapping capacity. So soil conservation makes sense pretty much everywhere. Of course, international cooperation for river basins is very important because, and it's simply not going to happen in, for example, Tigris-Euphrates right now, because the countries involved are just unable. So, Syria, Turkey, and I'm forgetting the third one. They're not. Obviously, Syria is not functioning. So there's not going to be any cooperative management of that river basin. It's not going to happen, not for now. But of course, that makes managing those rivers, and what that means is how much do people take out of it? How much do the countries take out of the rivers? That means you're not really kind of agreeing to a sustainable course for those sources of water. That becomes an issue. But when it's available, that's going to be an important thing to kind of get back on the table.
You mentioned several things such as violence and the strain that several countries such as Syria are currently going through. How much of the strain and violence do you think can be blamed on the lack of resources? Because many experts argue that truly that's the beginning, that's the start of the instability in the region. Mm-hmm.
I should say, first off, I'm not a Middle East expert, so I'm more focused on environmental issues as they are kind of situated in international context, and I have some familiarity with some of the areas, but just to say that at the outset, to understand how different environmental problems affect violence, you have to think about what is it that, first of all, you have to ask yourself, how does society operate? Which is kind of a very big kind of theoretical question. But if you think that, for example, there's a lot of kind of speculation on the role of climate change and really more kind of civil war type situations. If you think that if things get hot and people start fighting, that's probably not the right model to be thinking of. More relevant, though, is that when environmental problems cause the parameters for, say, for example, the way in which markets work, or the availability of key provisions. Are there traditions, for example, in whatever society we're talking about, to ameliorate specific kinds of stress? And that might be one way you think of it, right? Is that an environmental problem is a stress that goes into a portfolio of things happening. And so if that portfolio is overwhelmed with a whole bunch of stresses, then you potentially have a lot of social disruption, which can manifest in different ways. The thing, for example, with climate change is that it changes the parameters for water and temperature. So every area, of course, has evolved or developed in a niche that is partly defined by climate. And as you change the parameters of what that climate is expected to be, you're changing all the kind of ways in which people have expected to live in that area. That can cause stress. It can cause changes in, like food supplies, for example. Are there ways in which people can handle those stresses? Are there institutions that are in the countries that are strong, or are the institutions in the country weak? That will make a big difference in whether or not something really, if it cascades into violence. So it's a lot more complex. The other thing too is that potentially when you have different environmental problems, you've already had a social pathology to begin with. So there are things that there's probably people with more power kind of taking, for example, if you have scarce resources, it could be that people with more power are able to seize more, so then you have inequalities that then cause more environmental problems, and then those environmental problems cause more stress, et cetera, right? So the environmental problem is typically not the starting point. It's typically an effect of social pathology to begin with.
What are some beginning changes to increase food supplies that can be done on the individual level, if there are any?
At the individual level? So so people in the region, what can they do on an individual level? Well, it's tough because individuals typically are less capable than groups are. And so if we think about what can individuals do for any particular problem that we face in society, it's tough to think that, just tell people to store 3 days worth of water for hurricanes, right? We do in Florida, right? We know that people don't. So you have to have things in place at the social level. So societies have to be able to build resilience into their communities, expecting that especially people who are worse off aren't simply going to be able to. So, for example, if you have, let's say that a good example of this is when you have people, say in the United States, who want to protect themselves from pesticides. You say, okay, well, I'm going to buy organic then. Well, organic's expensive, so you're really talking about a class issue, right? So can you buy into the protection, as opposed to the society saying, let's protect our food supply. So instead of doing that, we create this what's called reverse quarantine, so that I can buy myself into safety. So thinking about what the individuals can do is important, because there are things that you have to be ready for. Any kinds of, it's important for households to be as resilient themselves as possible. But for talking about policy and that kind of thing, it really has to be at the social level.
Do you think that the United States' involvement in an attempt to increase food security will be a positive or a negative impact to the region long term?
Well, it's hard to say. The U.S. has cared very little about environmental protections that might lead to better food security. So the United States might be willing to improve situations for when it comes to like river management, like we were talking about. So they might, the United States might be able to facilitate processes like that will be helpful. But the U.S. has never really been enthusiastic about international environmental protection, minus some important exceptions. But the involvement of the U.S. at this point, I don't expect to be working on that level. Now, perhaps the U.S. can change kind of resources and the way the resources are operating in the region. That might be I know, for example, that the Navy is important in protecting desalination plants for Saudi Arabia. Okay, so they're making it better for Saudi Arabia, I guess, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say. It kind of depends on our mindset. So if our mindset is short-term and is not thinking about the broader kind of picture and way in which stress accumulates and hits the different societies, we're probably not going to be that helpful. And typically, foreign policy does not look towards a region and say, how can I strengthen that region? Foreign policy would say, okay, who are my friends, and what can I do for them so that they continue to
do for us.
Yeah, so that they continue to benefit me. So I kind of doubt that, as a region, that's not going to be very helpful. I could be wrong.
So, in your opinion, what is the most probable future of North Africa and the Middle East as it relates to the environment and environmental policy?
Yeah, I'm not an expert of that region, so it's too hard for me to. So when you think about a question like that, you think, okay, what is the history of the different societies in those regions? Certainly, we can expect a lot of stress, right? So there's, for example, we expect it for different parts of the MENA region, we expect it to get hotter and drier by mid-century, and then after that, hotter and drier. Meanwhile, you've had a lot of places growing in population, and that adds stress. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it certainly is in some circumstances. We know that there are specific resource scarcity issues that a lot of societies are going to have to deal with, including water. But another example is we had at UCF, we had an expert come and talk about his research on the kind of the root social causes for Somalian piracy. Well, it turns out that a lot of the people who are Somalian pirates, you don't think, okay, unless you're like a 4-year-old who likes Peter Pan, you don't really grow up thinking I want to be a pirate. That's something you do because essentially you've been pushed, and the push in this case it's complex, but part of that push was the depletion of coastal fisheries. When people were dependent on those coastal fisheries, they then had to find an alternative. Those kinds of things, I think, we should expect to intensify. One way to kind of visualize this is if we know that things are going to get hotter and drier, then we have to be ready to kind of adapt to those changes and start to prepare kind of redundant solutions for kind of helping societies get through that. In some places, they actually, part of the GCC region is expected to be almost uninhabitable by the end of the century because it'll be average temperatures will be just too hot. So some parts are going to be hit very, very hard by environmental change, and that's really something that governments in the region have to be thinking of right now. But typically, governments are terrible at this. So you think about people who are in power, oftentimes, unless you're a dictator, you're typically not in there for very long. So you have short-term kind of view, and even if you are a dictator, you probably don't care too much either about relieving stress for your people. So the kind of planning and kind of getting ahead of some of those already evident problems doesn't look to be kind of the strong suit right now. So I think problem solving is be a nice investment for many of these places, right? But oftentimes human beings in general have a hard time investing heavily for something that's in deep future, or something even in the relatively near future. But so, for example, mid-century, that's relatively near future, and we have a hard time because that means, okay, you're going to take resources now, that you otherwise want to do other stuff with, and then invest that in protecting something for the future. It's very, very hard to get politicians and leaders to commit to those things. So the region itself is going to see a number of important stresses that one hopes they'll be able to deal with in some ways, but you can't expect it to go smoothly in all the different countries.
What studies need to be done in order to gather the necessary information needed to deal with this crisis?
Which one?
The food security crisis that you're currently facing.
So you have different ones, right? You have some countries are just fine because they have enough oil money they can import their food, and they of course are in the Gulf countries that they're going to actually face some important problems, and they already know this, which is why some of the countries in the region are actually participating in, depends on how you see this process, investing in other countries' land. Other people call it land grabbing. Certainly, there are some social problems that come with this for people who are already in those places, and typically these pieces of land are in Africa. Academics always want to do more work and always want to do more research. Sometimes we have enough, to just kind of make a prudent decision already. But there are information problems. First of all, the countries in the region are almost unanimously very, very secretive about the flow of water going through their countries. They don't want to let other countries know how much they're taking. So that's an information issue. Certainly, some of the science for understanding the groundwater reserves is not employed in many of the countries, and so there's kind of some mystery as to how some of those groundwater resources are. That's not in all the countries, but in many. We know enough about climate change that if we just start working on that, nothing else comes to mind, though. There are probably a lot of things we still want to know, and oftentimes what we need to know are social things. So what is causing a particular problem is oftentimes at the hands of people. So if we can understand that, that's of course what environmental social scientists attempt to do, is get at root social causes and the kind of structures that are forcing problems.
You mentioned before that for governments to implement action, you need to come as a group.
Okay, so we need to solve problems socially, and that does require informed and semi-sovereign civil society. Even in the societies with dictators, they still require and use kind of the public. They still have an interaction with the public that's important. And what that all means is that when people come together in public, that's when you make civil society, right? So these are churches, parties, political parties, unions, etc. Even just bowling, leagues are part of civil society. But to the extent that people are able to understand their own interests and make that interest known, that is important. Oftentimes, however, people in the public don't necessarily understand what is best for kind of the well-being of their society, and that's sometimes because of propaganda or campaigns to mislead, where then civil society starts to believe in the wrong thing. Part of society, civil society, can be some of the most important agents of change, not necessarily always for the good either. If you have, say, for example, revolutions that aren't quite healthy, then oftentimes that's led by, people who aren't in the government, obviously, and people who aren't in industry, so they're coming together in civil society. Hopefully, you have an active, involved, engaged citizenry that is knowledgeable and doing beneficial things. But governments need that aspect because for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is because it casts legitimacy on the actions of government, and that's one of the kind of core needs of most states, if not all states.
How has your background in teaching environmental law and global perspectives allowed you to think differently about the food crisis?
I don't know if I do think differently about it, but what we try to do, in environmental social science is to try and understand the big forces that cause problems and solutions, right? So sometimes if you just look at a specific problem like a food shortage, you might say, well, that I got a quick solution for that, but if you don't understand what's causing the problem to begin with, then that makes it difficult. So it makes sometimes those solutions actually become regressive or make the problem worse. The analogy is if you have a broken kind of leaky pipe and all you do is just mop up the spill without kind of taking care of the broken pipe, you're actually not going to solve anything. So to the extent that you can study a society and its history and understand the forces, sometimes very malignant forces that are causing problems, then that helps you understand what are rational solutions. For food issues in the region, you're definitely going to have to tackle key political problems along the way, if not to begin with. If you don't do that, then you may not be solving anything.
If there are any government officials from the Middle East listening right now, what would your advice be to them and their current environmental issues?
Well, so leaders in the Middle East are listening to this, they say. Certainly, the things that will make sense for building, let's start from the beginning. If you have a food problem, like I said, there's probably something else behind that. If you can start to solve some of the bigger structural problems, then you'll start to create a more resilient kind of future for yourself. Oftentimes, like I said before, this involves a more cooperative approach. It involves conservation. Conservation pays off so many ways. It's typically unpopular when it means that you're supposed to kind of restrain yourself, but then in the future, it's oftentimes the most effective and efficient way of protecting the things that make food. So, you have to protect the preconditions of food and its availability. That includes, building relationships with your food suppliers. It means making sure that you don't erode the ability for you to grow food. It means that you have to be able to be ready for surprises and adapt. You certainly want to understand and protect key, what we call ecosystem services. So these are things like biodiversity. And that sounds like, you think, why do I need to protect biodiversity for food? Well, the reason is because essentially we eat biodiversity. For example, if you're growing crops and the crop gets a disease, we look to crop relatives to help those plants survive certain diseases or to deal with those diseases. In addition to some other reasons, but protecting the way that the different cycles, like the soil cycle, is an important thing. That'd be my initial kind of response to that question. But I think it also needs to be specific to the society. Like I said, the MENA region is populated with a lot of different kinds of societies, and they have different histories and different traditions, and those traditions oftentimes will come with important solutions that make sense for that particular area, and it may not make sense for other areas. But yeah.
Well, this concludes our session today. Thank you for your time. Dr. Hackis,
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
for having me.